Imagine a nation that wins, like absolutely every single war it fights.
Right.
They amass just unimaginable global wealth. They expand their borders across all these known continents. And then, as a direct, unavoidable result of that exact spectacular success, they completely destroy their own society.
It sounds like a contradiction, but
I mean, today, we aren't talking about a modern superpower. We are stepping way back into the world of the Roman Republic at the end of the 2nd century BC.
a place where absolute victory became the exact disease that tore the state apart.
Yeah, it's wild to think about. Welcome to the Deep Dive, everyone.
Glad to be here.
We are looking at a truly incredible source for this one. We actually have our hands on a brilliant lecture transcript from the late UCLA professor Eugene Weber.
From his renowned series, The Western Tradition, right?
Exactly. We're focusing on his deep, just totally unflinching exploration of how the Roman Republic fell and what took its place.
And what makes Professor Weber's analysis so vital is that he strips away all the marble statues, you know?
Yeah, the togas and the grand myth-making.
Right. He forces us to look at the raw, often ugly, very human mechanics of how a society functions.
Or, I guess, how a society dysfunctions when it's utterly blinded by its own triumphs.
Exactly.
So the mission for this deep dive is to really map out that dysfunction. We are going to explore how a thriving, victorious republic cannibalized itself from the inside out.
It's a fascinating process.
We'll look at how the privatization of the military paved the exact road for dictators, and how, out of the literal ashes of this republic, an autocratic empire was born that fundamentally wired the architecture of the modern world.
And I really want to explicitly invite you, the listener, to lean into the mechanics of this conversation today.
Yeah, definitely pay attention to the parallels.
Because as we dissect these historical events from over 2,000 years ago, I want you to pay close attention to the echoes, the dynamics we're going to explore: staggering wealth inequality, the hollowing out of the middle class.
The incredibly cynical electioneering.
Yes. And just the sheer struggle of a government trying to manage a world that has grown way too complex for its ancient institutions.
It really hits close to home.
I promise you, a lot of this is going to sound eerily, uncomfortably familiar to you today. I mean, human nature hasn't changed.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
We need to set the stage first. We are looking at the end of the 2nd century BC.
Right.
Rome has been expanding relentlessly. They've pushed deeply into Greece. They've pushed into Asia Minor. On paper, this is Rome triumphant.
Oh, absolutely. They are an absolute powerhouse.
Foreign wealth is just flowing into the Italian peninsula like never before. But Professor Weber points out this glaring, terrifying contradiction.
Yeah, the reality on the ground.
For the average, ordinary Roman citizen, this was not some golden age. It was a time of intense, terrifying anxiety and economic ruin.
Precisely. And to understand why that was the reality, we have to look really closely at the absolute backbone of the Roman state at that time.
The small freehold farmer.
Exactly. We have to strip away our modern concept of a military, right?
Because it wasn't a professional army yet.
No, the Roman military at this point was a militia system. It was composed of these citizen farmers who owned a small plot of land.
So they were basically drafted.
Yes. When Rome went to war, these men were drafted. They would quite literally leave their plows in the field, take up their swords, and march off to fight Rome's wars.
Right, so they were the ones who actually went to Greece and Asia and did the conquering.
They absolutely did.
They were the ones bleeding to expand these borders.
And this is where the tragic irony of the winner's curse really takes hold. These men go off to war, sometimes for years at a time.
Wow, years.
Yeah, they fight brutally hard, traumatic campaigns. The ones who are lucky enough to survive, and as Professor Weber notes, a staggering number of them did not, they finally return home to Italy.
And what do they find when they get back?
Their family farms have completely gone to pot.
Just total ruin.
The fields are overgrown, the irrigation ditches have collapsed, the infrastructure is crumbling, simply because the primary laborer has been absent for half a decade.
Which, I mean, makes sense on a purely practical level.
Yeah.
If you pull the primary physical laborer off a pre-industrial farm for years on end, nature takes it back.
Exactly.
But surely, I mean, they won the war, right? Rome is rich now. Couldn't they just rebuild?
You would think so.
What was actually stopping these veterans from just clearing the brush, planting a new crop, and getting back on their feet?
Well, this is where the macroeconomics of their victory utterly crushed them, because Rome had conquered these massive new provinces.
Like Sicily and North Africa.
Right, and parts of the East. Those provinces were now required to pay tribute to Rome, and they didn't just pay in gold.
They paid in grain, didn't they?
Primarily in cheap grain. So rivers of state-subsidized, artificially cheap grain are suddenly pouring into Italy from the very lands these soldier farmers had just risked their lives to conquer.
Wow. So supply just completely skyrockets, completely detached from the local Italian agricultural reality.
Exactly. The market in Rome is absolutely flooded. And what happens to prices when supply skyrockets?
They plummet to the floor.
They do. So, put yourself in the shoes of our veteran farmer. He gets home to a ruined farm. Through sheer grit, he manages to clear a field, scrape together a harvest of wheat, and he takes it to the local market.
Only to find out that the grain he broke his back to grow is essentially worthless.
Right. He cannot possibly compete with the volume of artificially cheap grain pouring in from overseas.
Let me put this in a modern context because it's such a profound economic disruption.
Please do.
Think of workers today who spend years engineering and building a revolutionary new piece of technology, maybe like a highly advanced automated manufacturing system.
Okay, yeah.
They build it, it works perfectly, it's a massive success for the company, and the immediate result is that the technology makes their own specific jobs entirely obsolete.
That is an excellent way to frame it.
They quite literally engineered their own unemployment.
They did. These citizen soldiers built the empire that made their own economic survival impossible, and the domino effect is just brutal.
Because they couldn't make a living, right?
Right. Because they couldn't make a living selling their crops, these family farmers fell into debt and eventually went completely bankrupt.
And someone was waiting to scoop all that up.
Yes. Waiting in the wings of this crisis was the wealthy patrician class, the senatorial elite, and the rich equestrian class.
The guys who didn't go fight.
Or the generals who got rich doing it. These people had plenty of capital from the spoils of war, so they stepped in and started buying up these small, failed family farms for pennies on the dollar.
Wait, did the wealthy elite realize they were systematically destroying the backbone of their own society? Like the very people who fought their wars?
It was almost certainly the latter. They were just capitalizing on a distressed asset market.
Or were they just completely blinded by the profit margins?
Blinded by the margins, yeah. They consolidated all of these small, bankrupt family plots into massive, sprawling agricultural estates.
Latifundia, right.
Yes, and here is the crucial pivot in the Roman economy. These wealthy landowners didn't just keep growing cheap grain.
Because there's no money in it.
Exactly. As Professor Weber points out, much of the Italian land was actually better suited for other agricultural models anyway. So they converted these massive new spreads into highly profitable commercial enterprises.
What were they growing instead?
They shifted to raising massive herds of cattle, or they planted highly lucrative cash crops, specifically grapes for wine and olives for olive oil.
But, I mean, shifting from a small family wheat farm to a massive commercial olive oil or wine estate, that requires a totally different kind of labor force.
It does. It requires scale, and it requires cheap, constant labor. And to run these massive estates, the wealthy elite did not hire back the bankrupt Roman citizens they had just displaced.
Right, because paying free citizens a fair wage would cut into the profit margins.
Exactly. Instead, they used slaves. You see, the exact same wars of expansion that had ruined the farmers financially had also flooded the Roman market with hundreds of thousands of human captives.
Oh, man. That's bleak.
So you have these huge, sprawling estates run strictly on the cheap, incredibly hard labor of newly acquired slaves. And as Weber notes, these slaves furnished this brutal labor in exchange for nothing more than bare subsistence.
That is just utterly devastating.
Yeah.
So the rich get astronomically richer, and the middle-class citizen farmer is totally wiped off the map.
Completely erased.
Let's sit with the psychological impact of this for a second. You are a Roman veteran. You have marched across the known world. You have killed for the glory of Rome. You watched your friends die.
You've given everything.
Yeah. You come back, your farm is ruined, the market is rigged against you, you go bankrupt. Your ancestral land is bought by a wealthy politician who replaces you with a slave, and you have literally nowhere to go.
It's a nightmare scenario.
What do? Where do you go?
You do exactly what desperate, displaced, landless, rural populations have done throughout all of recorded human history. You move to the urban center.
To the city.
You head to Rome itself, hoping to find wage labor or some kind of support.
Swelling the ranks of what Professor Weber calls the proletarians.
Exactly. The Latin root of that word, proletarius, essentially referred to a citizen whose only wealth, whose only contribution to the Roman state was their offspring, their proles.
Because they owned zero property.
Right. So almost overnight, The city of Rome experiences this exploding population of angry, displaced, unemployed, trauma-hardened, combat-trained veterans forced into squalid urban living conditions.
And there just weren't enough jobs in the city, right?
Nowhere near enough. So they were forced to live on the bounty of the state, eventually relying on subsidized grain doles just to survive.
And if you are a cynical, ambitious politician looking out over a massive, densely packed crowd of poor, angry, desperate people who completely rely on the state for their daily bread,
You see an opportunity.
yeah, you don't necessarily see a humanitarian crisis. You see a resource. You see a highly manipulatable political base.
It is a massive political powder keg sitting right in the center of the Capitol, just waiting for someone to drop a match. And the politicians of the late Republic knew exactly how to play them.
Which brings us to a massive systemic failure. Because you have this literal powder keg in the Capitol, this massive social and economic crisis. And we have to look at how the political class, the people actually in charge of the Republic, try to handle it.
It's a Senate.
Let's look at the Senate.
Hmm.
The Senate is the governing body. Why aren't they fixing this? Why aren't they passing laws to protect these veterans?
To understand the profound failure of the Senate, you have to understand what the Roman Senate actually was structurally. Professor Weber uses a truly fantastic analogy here.
Oh, I love this analogy.
The Roman Senate was essentially designed to be a local municipal council. Its constitutional architecture was built to govern a single city-state, Rome, and maybe the surrounding Italian countryside.
Right.
But through this massive, rapid, explosive century of military expansion, this municipal town council had suddenly, almost accidentally, been propelled into governing half the known world.
It is like taking the city council of a mid-sized town today, say Peoria, Illinois, and suddenly telling them, congratulations, you are now the United Nations Security Council, the Global Federal Reserve, and the Department of Defense, all combined. Have at it.
That is exactly what it was like. They were fundamentally, structurally not equipped for the job.
No kidding.
And more importantly, the men sitting in those seats didn't want the job to change. The conservative senators, the elite patricians who held the real power, were completely indifferent to the plight of the urban poor.
They just wanted to keep the money flowing.
As Weber points out, most of these wealthy senators just wanted the world to stand perfectly still so they could enjoy their new wealth and status.
But the world never stands still. Especially not when you've just conquered half of it.
Never. Now, we should be fair. The Senate was very good at one specific thing.
What was that?
If there was a foreign problem, say a rebellion in a distant province, a border dispute, or a pirate king acting up, they knew exactly how to handle that.
Right. Military force.
They would raise an army, appoint a general, and throw soldiers at the problem. That was their one playbook.
When all you have is a hammer, every foreign policy issue looks like a nail.
Right. But when it came to complex, highly nuanced domestic, social, and economic crises, like a collapsing agrarian middle class, massive wealth inequality, and urban overcrowding, they were utterly clueless.
They had no administrative tools to deal with it at all.
None. And frankly, they were too busy playing their own internal vicious political games for prestige and lucrative provincial governorships.
Okay, speaking of those political games, the source material gives us this incredible, chilling glimpse into the electioneering playbook of the time.
Oh, the Cicero letter.
This might be one of my favorite parts of Professor Weber's lecture. It mentions a document, essentially a campaign manual, written for the famous statesman and philosopher Cicero by his brother Quintus, on exactly how to win an election in Rome.
It's remarkably blunt.
And it is so nakedly cynical, so devoid of actual policy, it almost takes your breath away.
It really is the dark arts of retail politics laid completely bare.
His brother basically tells him, look, flattery is generally considered wrong and shameful in ordinary honorable life, but it is absolutely strictly necessary if you're running for political office.
He says, you must flatter the voters endlessly.
Yeah. Pretend to know them well. Have your slaves whisper their names in your ear so you can greet them by name in the forum.
Be overly generous, be open-handed, promise them whatever they want to hear.
It is the calculated manufacturing of the illusion of intimacy, making the voter feel seen, making them feel important, even if the entire interaction is a complete fabrication designed solely to extract a vote.
Exactly. And it gets so much darker. Quintus advises him, if possible, aggressively accuse your political competitors of having a bad reputation.
Just smear them.
Accuse them of crime, of vice, of bribery, smear them relentlessly in public, just throw mud and see what sticks because it deflects attention from your own flaws.
What's fascinating here is how deeply modern that sounds. The tactics of political manipulation, of coordinated character assassination, of manufacturing a folksy, relatable persona while hiding your elite status.
Yeah, these are not modern inventions.
Right. It wasn't born of the television era or the internet age. This is basic human psychology being weaponized for political power. And the Romans had it down to an absolute science over 2 millennia ago.
They really did.
But surely not everyone in politics was just playing this cynical, self-serving game, right? There had to be people who looked at this crisis, the ruined veteran farmers, the oblivious rich Senate, and try to actually fix the structural rot.
There were.
We have to talk about the reformers. Let's look at the Gracchi brothers.
Yes, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. They are incredibly important polarizing figures. We're talking about the late 130s BC, specifically 133 BC for Tiberius.
Oh, yeah.
Now, Tiberius Gracchus was not some peasant revolutionary. He was a highborn noble. He was the grandson of Scipio Africanus, the legendary general who defeated Hannibal.
Oh, wow. So he was establishment.
Very much so. He possessed impeccable patrician credentials. But he looked at the Italian countryside, saw the massive slave estates, saw the displaced veterans in the streets, and realized the Roman state was rotting from the inside out.
He saw the writing on the wall.
He recognized that without a property-owning middle class, Rome would eventually have no soldiers. So he took up the cause of the poor.
So what was his actual legislative plan? How do you fix an economic crisis this deep and entrenched?
His proposed reform was actually based on existing but long ignored Roman law. He wanted to enforce old limits on the size of the largest states that the wealthy had built up on public land technically owned by the Roman state.
Okay, so a redistribution plan.
His plan was to take the excess public land back from the wealthy elites who were squatting on it, parcel it out, and redistribute it, providing small, functioning farm plots back to the landless poor.
Wow.
It was a massive agrarian reform aimed at rebuilding that citizen farmer class and getting the mob out of the city.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here. On paper, it seems like a logical attempt to reverse the exact problem. But wasn't Tiberius essentially threatening the vast fortunes of the entire senatorial class?
Oh, absolutely.
He's looking at the most powerful men in the world and saying, I'm going to confiscate your most profitable assets. How did the conservative Senate react to one of their own proposing this? Did they try to debate him? Did they just use their political power to vote it down?
They murdered him.
Just flat out, in broad daylight, murdered him.
Yes.
Yeah.
Tiberius pushed his reforms aggressively, sometimes bypassing traditional senatorial norms to do it, which terrified the elite. So a group of conservative senators led by the Pontifex Maximus,
Their chief priest.
the chief priest of Rome, incredibly along with their armed clients and slaves, cornered Tiberius Gracchus during an assembly, and they beat him to death.
That is just savage.
And here is a deeply symbolic detail that always sticks with me from the historical accounts, which Weber touches on. The senators didn't even use swords. They didn't bring traditional weapons.
What do they use?
They ripped apart the wooden benches and chairs from the public assembly and beat a sitting tribune of the plebes to death with the furniture of the Republic.
Beaten to death with chairs by the elected leaders of the Republic. It sounds like a mob hit, a gang war, not a functioning government.
It was a shocking, unprecedented violation of the most sacred norms of the Roman Republic. Political violence had officially entered the bloodstream of the state.
And it didn't end with Tiberius, did it?
It didn't stop there. About a decade later, his younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, achieved the same office and tried to carry on Tiberius's work, pushing even broader, more radical reforms.
Now let me guess.
He met the exact same fate. He was ultimately driven to suicide to avoid being murdered by an armed mob organized and sanctioned by the Senate.
So the Senate wins. They use brute force, they crush the reformers, they keep their massive, profitable slave estates, and they maintain the status quo.
They certainly thought they won. They thought they had amputated the radical element. But what's fascinating here is that the murders of the Gracchi brothers permanently, irrevocably altered the political landscape.
How so?
You cannot unring the bell of political violence. Once you show that murder is a viable veto against legislation you don't like, the Republic is mortally wounded.
Right. You've normalized assassination.
And more importantly, the Gracchi brothers had inadvertently created a political blueprint. For the first time in Roman history, a distinct popular party, the populares, had emerged to actively challenge the entrenched authority of the Senate, the optimates.
But Weber makes a really crucial, nuanced distinction here that we need to highlight. This wasn't some noble birth of a modern egalitarian democracy.
Right at all.
The populares weren't exactly fighting for universal human rights.
No, we should be very careful not to romanticize it. The Popular Party wasn't about giving everyone an equal vote in some democratic utopia.
Right.
The situation the Gracchi brothers left behind was practically made to order for cynical, highly ambitious men. These future politicians realized that you could completely bypass the traditional authority of the Senate if you knew how to use and manipulate the grievances, the class hatred, and the social unrest of the urban mob.
It became a weaponized tool.
Exactly. The urban poor were no longer just a problem to be solved. They were a political bludgeon to be wielded by future dictators for their own personal career advancement.
Okay, let's take stock of where we are. You have a corrupt, violently stubborn Senate on one side, desperately hoarding their wealth.
Yep.
You have an angry, manipulatable, traumatized populace on the other side. The tension is unbearable. But there is still one piece of the puzzle missing. To actually overthrow a republic, you need more than angry voters and street brawls.
You need an army.
You need swords. You need professional military force. And that brings us to the fatal pivot, the spark that ignited the catastrophic civil wars. And it all comes down to one man's military reform. We have to talk about the General Marius.
Gaius Marius. The year is roughly 107 BC. Marius is a highly capable, fiercely ambitious general, a new man without a deep patrician bloodline.
Okay.
And he is facing a severe existential military crisis. Rome is fighting a difficult war in North Africa, and they are about to face a massive, terrifying invasion of Germanic tribes from the north.
A two-front war.
But Marius has a problem, a severe manpower shortage. Remember, the old requirement was that you had to own property to serve in the legions.
Right, the citizen farmer.
But because the wealthy had bought up all the land, as we discussed, the pool of eligible property-owning citizens had shrunk drastically. Meanwhile, the rich citizens who did still qualify were growing increasingly less enthusiastic about serving in brutal foreign wars because, as Weber notes, they had far better, more profitable things to do at home.
Right, they were busy running their massive commercial olive oil empires. They don't want to go freeze in a swamp fighting Germanic tribes.
Exactly. So Marius is stuck. He needs an army, and he needs it now. So he introduces an innovation that completely reshapes the Roman military, and in doing so, effectively dooms the Republic.
What does he do?
He throws out the property and financial requirements for enlistment entirely. He looks at the capits, censi, the head count, the landless urban poor we've been talking about, and he says, I don't care if you own land. If you are a Roman citizen and you volunteer to fight, the state will provide your weapons, the state will provide your armor, and the state will pay you a wage.
Wait, hold on. Let me push back here. We are looking back with 2020 hindsight and saying he doomed the Republic. But Marius was facing a massive existential national security threat.
He was.
Hundreds of thousands of Germanic warriors are marching on Italy. He needed troops instantly to save Rome. Are we really blaming him for dooming the Republic when he was just trying to solve an immediate, terrifying crisis? Didn't he do the only logical thing he could do?
That is the tragedy of it. You are entirely correct. It wasn't an act of malicious treason. It was an act of desperate pragmatism.
It worked, right?
It solved Marius's immediate manpower problem brilliantly. The poor, desperate proletarians absolutely rushed to sign up. It was a job.
A way out of the slums.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the long-term structural consequence of this pragmatic decision was absolutely catastrophic.
Why? What went wrong?
Because we have to look at the mechanics of Roman military pay. The actual daily wage provided by the state for a legionary was terrible. It was an absolute pittance, barely enough for daily expenses. So a professional soldier could not possibly survive, let alone build a future, on his base pay alone.
So how did they survive then? What was the financial incentive to join this new professional army if the pay was garbage?
They relied entirely, utterly on their commanding general. A successful commander was culturally expected to provide his men with a generous share of the spoils of war, the loot, the gold, the enslaved captives.
Oh, I see.
And critically, when the campaign was over, the general was expected to use his political clout back in Rome to secure a parcel of land for his veterans upon their discharge so they could retire securely.
Their pension.
Exactly. Those rewards, which could dramatically alter a poor man's life, were entirely under the control and the political maneuvering of the individual general, not the anonymous Senate.
Okay, let me make sure I am fully wrapping my head around the mechanics of this because it's the hinge of the whole story.
Go for it.
Because the Roman state wouldn't or couldn't pay them a living wage or guarantee a pension. The soldiers' entire financial future, their retirement plan, their family's security was solely 100% dependent on their boss, the general who recruited them.
Yes. The sacramentum, the sacred military oath, fundamentally shifted in practice.
Which means the loyalty of the army fundamentally shifts. They aren't fighting for the abstract idea of Rome or the Republic anymore.
No.
They certainly aren't fighting for the Senate. They are fighting for Marius or Sulla or whoever is writing the checks and promising the land.
You've isolated the exact cancer that killed the Republic. The Roman legions ceased to be the army of the state and became the private, loyal armies of their individual commanders. It was the total privatization of the military apparatus. And the generals, being ambitious politicians, knew exactly what this meant.
They figured it out pretty quick.
Oh, yeah. They realized almost immediately that their legions were no longer just instruments of foreign policy. They were personal piggy banks, and more importantly, they were personal protection forces that could be leveraged for domestic political power.
And this structural shift breeds a whole new, terrifying kind of leader. We are no longer talking about the stoic, civic-minded Roman of the early Republic, the guy who serves his term and goes back to his farm.
Not at all.
We're talking about warlords, men who view the state as their personal property. And the source material gives us this utterly wild, almost cinematic description of one of these new general politicians, a man named Lucullus.
Ah, yes. Licinius Lucullus. He is the poster child for the decadent late Republic. He was a highly successful, ruthless commander in the East, fighting kings like Mithridates. Through these campaigns, he acquired unimaginable, practically incalculable personal wealth. He eventually loses his command to a rival and retires to private life in Rome around 63 BC.
And what does his retirement look like?
Plutarch, the ancient biographer, writes extensively about his retirement, and it is a portrait of grotesque, almost surreal excess.
I have to share some of the specific details from this text because it is just mind-blowing when you compare it to the poverty of the mob.
Let's hear it.
Plutarch lists what Lucullus gets up to with his war loot. He says his life was filled with constant drinking bouts, endless banquets, and what were practically orgies. He had nighttime torch races.
It's wild.
He built sumptuous, sprawling buildings, massive porticos, lavish private baths, and collected massive amounts of Greek paintings and statues. He literally reshaped the geography of his estates, cutting channels through mountains to let seawater into his private fish ponds.
Plutarch explicitly calls it all frivolity, and Weber points out exactly why Plutarch is so deeply offended by this lifestyle. It isn't just about the money.
What was it?
It's that Lucullus completely lacks gravitas. Gravitas was that core Roman virtue of dignity, seriousness, weightiness, and self-sacrificing duty to the state. It was the defining characteristic of a Roman patrician.
And Lucullus just didn't care.
He has abandoned it completely. He is acting like an Eastern potentate. He is basically a flamboyant, untouchable, billionaire playboy.
And there is this one anecdote in the lecture that perfectly captures his unbelievable, reality-distorting arrogance.
Oh, the dinner story.
Yes. One evening, Lucullus is dining completely alone at his estate. No guests are expected, just him. So his slaves, the steward, trying to be reasonable and practical, prepares just one modest course for dinner.
Right.
He figures, hey, it's just the boss tonight. No need to break out the imported flamenco tongues and the vintage wine.
A completely logical assumption for anyone managing a household.
Right. But Lucullus becomes absolutely furious. He calls the slave in and completely dresses him down. And the quote is, "What, do you not know that today Lucullus dines with Lucullus?"
It is hilarious on one level, but it is also deeply revealing of the pathology of these men.
Yeah, his ego is just massive.
His ego has entirely eclipsed the state. He views himself as royalty, worthy of a banquet even when he is sitting alone in a room. And as Professor Weber astutely points out, men like Lucullus had vast, unquenchable appetites, not just for luxury, not just for fine food or art, but for power.
And they had the means to back it up.
Exactly. That power, that untouchable arrogance rested entirely on the fact that they, or men exactly like them, had legions of heavily armed, fiercely loyal men who answered to them personally.
I want you, the listener, to pause and really genuinely imagine this scenario in a modern context.
Yeah.
It's hard to wrap our heads around.
It is.
Imagine if today's mega billionaires didn't just have high-end corporate security teams, but actually commanded their own massive, private, heavily armed militias. Imagine a tech CEO or a hedge fund manager with 40,000 combat-hardened, fully equipped troops who were legally loyal only to the billionaire's personal bank account, completely independent of the national government or the military chain of command.
It is a terrifying thought experiment, and it illustrates exactly, mechanically, why the Republic was doomed.
Right.
Because once these general politicians realized the absolute unchecked power they possessed through these private armies, it was only a matter of time before they turned those weapons around and pointed them directly at Rome itself to settle their political disputes.
Which brings us to the bloody, chaotic era that Weber describes as the 1st century BC. This is a period defined entirely by rival warlords marching on their own capital city.
Yes, the heavy hitters of Roman history, Marius, Sulla, Pompey the Great, and eventually Julius Caesar, they each take turns acting as the ultimate strongman.
And the pattern was pretty much the same every time, right?
The pattern became completely predictable. They would manufacture a crisis or take advantage of a real one, march their private, fiercely loyal army into the city of Rome, violating the most sacred taboo of the Republic, and essentially hold a sword to the Senate's collective throat.
And force the Senate to legally vote them extraordinary powers.
Right. They needed the veneer of legality. Ostensibly, they always claimed they were doing it for the good of Rome, to bring order and stability to a broken state.
Of course.
But once they had that legal authority rubber-stamped by a terrified captive Senate, the real brutal work began. They would systematically eliminate their political enemies.
Just outright purge them.
Yes. Sulla, for instance, literally posted lists of his political opponents in the forum called prescriptions, offering bounties for their heads.
Oh my God.
This ushered in an era of organized, state-sanctioned political murder that, as Weber dryly notes, would fill the history books with the most fascinating gore for centuries to come.
Let's focus on Pompey for a second, because his rise perfectly illustrates how structurally broken this system had become.
Yeah.
The text notes that at just 28 years old, Pompey, who hadn't even held major political office, was commissioned to raise an army to protect the Senate from other overly ambitious generals.
Think about the sheer desperate absurdity of that policy. The legitimate government of Rome is hiring a young warlord to protect them from other warlords.
Exactly. And Pompey goes out, he is a military genius, he puts down major rebellions, but in the process, predictably, that massive army he raised becomes his private army. His soldiers direct their oath of loyalty not to the Senate who commissioned them, but to Pompey personally.
And suddenly Pompey holds all the cards in the deck. He returns to Italy, and he can use this massive army to dominate and intimidate the Senate into giving him even more lucrative commands, more honors, more control.
He doesn't even have to fight them.
No, he doesn't even need to overthrow them violently every single time. The sheer looming implication of his legions camped outside the city is enough to brush aside the senators and legalize his de facto hold on the state.
It's extortion.
It was extortion on a national constitutional scale. It had become a government not of laws, but of men, highly ambitious, deeply powerful, completely ruthless men.
And while all these Roman elites are fighting their bloody Game of Thrones inside the capital and across Italy, what is happening to the rest of the empire? Because Rome controls an extraordinary amount of territory by now. They're supposed to be governing millions of people.
The periphery of the empire was incredibly unstable. The massive expansion had brought Rome face to face with new, formidable threats.
Who are they dealing with?
In the east, you have the growing sophisticated power of the Parthian Empire, which had replaced the Persians. In the north, there is the constant looming thundercloud of hostile Germanic peoples. In the south, you have Arab raids in Asia and the Numidians in Africa.
It is a geopolitical pressure cooker on every border.
Yeah.
And internally, in the provinces Rome already officially controlled and pacified, the source material describes them vividly as muttering volcanoes. Why were they so incredibly volatile? What was Rome doing wrong?
It comes down to profound administrative rot. Rome simply had no permanent civil service, no professional, trained bureaucracy to manage this vast, complex territory.
So who was in charge?
Provincial governors were appointed by the Senate, usually as a reward for political loyalty, and usually for just a single one-year term.
1 year. You could barely figure out where the bathrooms are in a governor's palace in a year, let alone understand the local customs, the economy, and effectively govern a massive foreign province.
Exactly. They were amateurs, and their performance depended entirely on their individual moral character, which, given the ambitious, debt-ridden men we were talking about in the late Republic, was highly variable.
Meaning they were corrupt.
Deeply. Many saw their one-year term purely as a chance to recoup the massive debts they incurred running for office in Rome. But the real horror, the thing that made the provinces muttering volcanoes, was the economic extortion.
How bad was it?
The provinces were the chief source of income for Rome, but the Republic didn't actually have a mechanism to collect its own taxes. They outsourced it.
I need to understand the mechanics of this because this sounds wild. They basically privatized the collection of sovereign taxes.
Yes.
Right.
They used a system called tax farming. They farmed the tax collection out to private syndicates, joint stock companies of wealthy Roman capitalists known as the publicani.
How does a Roman corporation tax a province? How does that actually work?
It worked like an auction. These private corporations would assess a province, say the province of Asia. They would calculate the estimated tax revenue, and then they would pay the Roman state that lump sum up front in cash.
Well, the Senate must have loved that.
The Senate loved this because it meant instant guaranteed revenue for the treasury without having to do any administrative work. But then the publicani would travel to that province, backed by the threat of Roman military force, and they would ruthlessly extort the native population for every single coin they could squeeze out.
Oh, because they keep the difference.
Yes, because anything they collected above that initial lump sum they paid to the Senate was pure, unadulterated profit for their shareholders.
Oh my God. The incentive structure is purely geared toward absolute maximum extraction.
It is practically engineered for abuse. They would use violence, they would confiscate land, they would enslave locals who couldn't pay.
So the provinces get crushed.
The state got a fraction of the actual wealth, the capitalist syndicates got obscenely rich, and the native populations were bled completely dry.
It is essentially a mafia shakedown sanctioned by the state apparatus.
Yeah.
If that is the reality for millions of people in the provinces, Rome isn't exporting civilization or law. It's exporting organized extortion.
Yeah.
No wonder the provinces were muttering volcanoes. The Republic was fundamentally, irreparably broken on every conceivable level. Economically, militarily, administratively.
It truly was. The necessary systemic reforms simply couldn't come from the Senate because they were too conservative, too protective of their wealth, and completely paralyzed by self-interest.
And the Popular Party wasn't going to fix it either.
No, the reforms certainly weren't going to come from the Radical Popular Party either because they had devolved into demagogues mostly just interested in leveraging the mob for raw power.
So what's the end game?
It became clear to almost every thinking person in Rome, and certainly in the provinces, that the chaotic, extortionate republic had to be replaced by a single, strong ruler who could impose order. The only question left to answer in blood was, who was that ruler going to be?
And out of that chaotic, multi-generational, bloody struggle, one man finally emerges totally victorious in 46 BC, Julius Caesar.
Yes. The ultimate, culminating general politician. He marches his loyal, battle-hardened legions across the Rubicon, defeats his rival Pompey in a massive civil war, takes absolute power, and the Senate, now entirely cowed and purged of his enemies, rushes to shower him with unprecedented honors.
And I love this specific detail from the source. It is so human and so petty. Of all the grand honors the Senate heaps upon him, and there were many, the text notes, his absolute favorite honor was the right to wear the triumphal laurel wreath on his head at all times.
A potent symbol of ultimate military victory.
Well, yes, but primarily the text specifically says he loved it because he was deeply insecure about his thinning hair, and the wreath made his baldness less conspicuous.
It is true. Even the conqueror of the known world, the man who brought the Republic to its knees, was deeply vain about his receding hairline.
But the other honors the Senate voted him were far more serious and indicative of the Republic's death. He is voted consul, he is made the first dictator for life, dictator perpetuo. They renamed the month of his birth after him, July, and he is given the official title of imperator.
That is a critical linguistic and political shift. Originally, during the Republic, imperator simply meant a victorious general. It was a temporary title your troops shouted at you on the battlefield after a great victory.
But Caesar changes it.
Right. Under Caesar, it began to morph and solidify into what it signifies today. Emperor, the permanent sovereign ruler.
But his reign as sovereign ruler is incredibly short. He doesn't get to enjoy the laurel wreath for long. Just 2 years later, in 44 BC, on the Ides of March, He is brutally murdered on the floor of the Senate.
By a conspiracy of men who, despite everything we have just discussed, the corruption, the warlords, the structural failure, were still fundamentally unwilling to see the idea of the Republic die so easily.
But it's such a naive plan, isn't it? They thought by simply cutting off the head of the dictator, the Republic would magically heal itself. They thought they could just reset the clock to a century prior.
It was incredibly naive. They had no plan for the day after the assassination. As Professor Weber points out, the senator's desperate, bloody assassination of Caesar didn't save the Republic. The Republic was structurally doomed, regardless of their efforts.
So what did they actually accomplish?
All they achieved by killing Caesar was plunging Rome right back into the nightmare of anarchy and yet another devastating civil war, which ultimately sets the stage for the man who would actually solve the puzzle of Rome. Let's look at the rise of Augustus and the architecture of the new empire.
Okay, so the anarchy following Caesar's death was brutal and lasted for over a decade. But finally, in 31 BC, at the massive naval battle of Actium off the coast of Greece, Caesar's grandnephew and posthumously adopted heir, Octavian, emerges completely victorious.
Right.
He defeats his last serious Roman rival, Mark Antony, who had famously allied with Cleopatra, the last Ptolemaic queen of Egypt.
So Octavian is the last warlord standing. He is the absolute master of the entire Mediterranean world. The legions answer only to him.
He's got all the power.
He inherits all of Caesar's wealth and powers, and within a few years, the Senate gives him a slew of new military and religious titles, most notably the revered title, Augustus.
And, fittingly, like his adoptive uncle, he gets a month named after him too, August. But we need to understand that Augustus is a fundamentally different political creature than Julius Caesar.
Oh, completely.
Caesar was blatant. He took the title dictator for life, he flirted with kingship, and he practically dared the remaining Republicans to try and stop him. Augustus, however, was far more subtle and infinitely more brilliant in his political engineering.
He really was.
How so? What was his secret? How did he succeed in establishing permanent one-man rule where Caesar got stabbed 23 times for trying the exact same thing?
Augustus mastered the art of covert authoritarianism. He deeply understood Roman psychology. He knew the Roman elite still obsessed over the idea of the Republic. They obsessed over the tradition of the Senate, even if the actual functional reality of the Republic had been dead for a century.
So he just played along.
Exactly. So Augustus maintained the intricate illusion of a functioning republic. He adamantly refused to ever call himself a king or a dictator. Instead, he simply called himself princeps, which translates merely to first citizen. He ostensibly claimed to still rule in partnership with the Senate.
But it was just elaborate political theater, right? He still held all the swords.
Completely. Behind the scenes, behind the veil of Republican tradition, he systematically built an unassailable imperial bureaucracy and a massive professional imperial army of defense, both of which answered strictly, legally, and financially only to him.
And the Senate just let him do it.
He slowly, carefully colonized the Senate with his own loyal men. The civil service, which was nominally supposed to be under the Senate's scrutiny, was entirely filled with Augustus's hand-picked choices. He dominated everything while brilliantly pretending to just be a humble, exhausted servant of the state.
It is an absolute masterclass in political engineering and optics. And the ultimate result of this total centralized control is what becomes known as the Pax Romana.
The Roman peace. It is the greatest monument to his incredibly long reign. It ushered in the longest period of relative peace and internal stability the Mediterranean world has ever known. The civil wars finally stopped.
And there's a really surprising silver lining to this autocratic takeover that the source material highlights. Because Augustus needed a massive, reliable bureaucracy to run this sprawling empire efficiently, he couldn't just rely on tax farmers and amateur senators anymore. It accidentally created a massive wave of social mobility.
Yes, a profound shift in Roman society. The old republic was a deeply exclusive, aristocratic club for the patrician elite, but the new, sprawling imperial administration needed thousands of competent administrators, civil servants, tax collectors, supply chain managers, and clerks.
You needed talent, not just bloodlines.
And Augustus didn't care about your ancient noble bloodline. He cared about competence, efficiency, and above all, personal loyalty to him. So these vital roles were recruited heavily from the general body of citizens, specifically the equestrian class.
The text even points out that sometimes these incredibly vital, powerful roles were filled by ex-slaves or freedmen. If you were smart, capable, and loyal, suddenly there was a bureaucratic ladder you could climb that simply didn't exist in the rigid republic.
It was a form of bureaucratic meritocracy, at least in its early stages. But Augustus was smart enough to know that a bureaucracy alone couldn't hold an empire together ideologically.
He needed a story to tell them.
He needed a social glue to bind the people to the new regime. So alongside the civil service, he deployed a massive, highly coordinated cultural campaign.
Right. Professor Weber spends time talking about how Augustus tried to aggressively reawaken citizens to their civic duties, to keep them loyal to the state and moral in their private lives. He passed moral legislation, he revived old Roman virtues, utilizing ancient Roman history and myths to deliberately shape public morality.
The way Weber frames this is brilliant. He compares it directly to how American history and folklore was once utilized in early education.
Like the cherry tree story.
Think about the apocryphal story of young George Washington saying, "I cannot tell a lie," about chopping down the cherry tree. Is it a historically accurate account? No, of course not. But it was widely used in schools to teach small children a foundational moral lesson about honesty and civic virtue.
It makes total sense.
Or stories of pioneer resilience used to encourage adults toward patriotism and enterprise. Augustus did the exact same thing with Roman myth. He heavily patronized writers like Virgil to write the Aeneid. He weaponized nostalgia and myth to create compliant, patriotic, moral citizens who believed in the destiny of Rome under his leadership.
So what does this all mean? If we look at the big picture of Augustus's incredible rise to power, the Roman public, after 100 years of constant civil wars, political murders in the streets, massive wealth inequality, and the sheer terror of warlords marching legions through their farms,
They were simply exhausted.
they were done. They essentially made a grand societal trade. They traded the chaotic, terrifying freedom of a broken republic for the strict, predictable, authoritarian security of a autocracy. And they eagerly, willingly accepted it.
They traded liberty for the Pax Romana. They chose order over freedom. But as Weber makes explicitly, structurally clear, this entire massive political, social, and cultural structure, this brilliant illusion of a restored republic, rested entirely on exactly one pillar, the new imperial army.
Which means we need to talk about how the army functioned now. Because under Augustus, the army undergoes a profound transformation. It stops being the problem that destroys the state and becomes the foundation that holds the entire civilized world together.
We have to contrast it with what came before. Remember the chaotic days of Marius, Sulla, and Pompey, where commanders were basically military entrepreneurs, gambling on their own charismatic abilities to recruit soldiers, extract wealth from the provinces, and march on Rome.
Right, the private billionaire militias that relied on the general for their retirement land.
Exactly. Augustus ends that dynamic completely and forever. Under the new empire, every single army commander depended directly on the emperor.
So the loyalty shifts back.
The soldiers swore their oath, the sacramentum, directly to Augustus, not to their local general. And crucially, Augustus created the aerarium militare, a dedicated military treasury funded by specific taxes, ensuring the state paid the soldiers their wages and their retirement bonuses.
So they're no longer warlords, they are state employees.
Exactly. And just like modern generals, these commanders could be transferred from one army on the Rhine to another army on the Euphrates at the emperor's complete will. It permanently broke the personal patron-client bond between general and soldier that had destroyed the republic.
And the actual mission of the army fundamentally shifts too. The era of aggressive, massive expansion, the conquering of Greece and Asia that flooded Rome with wealth and slaves and started this whole crisis, comes to a grinding halt.
It had to halt for two primary reasons. First, as Weber notes, everyone was just heartily, deeply sick of fighting. A century of Roman blood being spilled by Roman swords will do that to a culture.
Definitely.
But second, and more practically, war is ultimately an economic enterprise. In the long run, war has to pay for itself.
And the Romans had basically run out of profitable, highly developed people to conquer, right?
Exactly. They had completely secured the wealthy, urbanized Mediterranean basin. What was left? If you pushed further north or east, you hit the deep, impenetrable forests of Germania and the vast steppes.
Just trees and tribes.
There were few enemies with concentrated wealth, cities, or gold worth taking. As Professor Weber succinctly puts it, there was little treasure in the lands of the barbarians, only trouble. Further expansion would only cost massive amounts of money, lives, and strain the administration without bringing any tangible economic benefits to the treasury.
So the Roman army executes a massive strategic pivot. They go from being a highly mobile, offensive conquering force to becoming a massive, static defensive force. Their main job now is keeping the poor, hungry, migrating barbarians out of the rich, pacified Roman territory.
They become incredibly expert in building permanent border fortifications. They string out small garrisons and massive, entrenched legionary camps along thousands of miles of imperial boundaries, creating the limes, like the massive fortifications along the Rhine and Danube rivers. The army became a thin, heavily armed wall, physically protecting Mediterranean civilization.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this shift to a static defensive army has mind-blowing historical consequences for Europe. It is not just about military strategy or border control. It is about geography, economics, and urban development. Because what happens when you park a legion of 5,000 men in a permanent stone camp on a river for 100 years?
You accidentally build a city. Those permanent military camps, the castra, became the seeds of massive European urban centers. Think about the economics of it. You have thousands of soldiers with guaranteed, steady, disposable income from the emperor.
They need places to spend it.
They need supply lines, so massive, permanent stone roads were built connecting the camps. Because the soldiers have money, merchants, artisans, blacksmiths, and entertainers flocked to the camps to sell them goods and services. They set up civilian settlements, the cannae, right outside the fort walls. Soon, temples, public administrative buildings, amphitheaters, and bathhouses spring up.
The text lists some of the major European cities that were literally born as Roman army camps: Vienna, Budapest, York in England, Lisbon, Bordeaux, and my personal favorite linguistic connection, Cologne, Germany, which comes directly from its Roman founding name, Colonia.
These weren't just military outposts. They quickly evolved into vibrant, wealthy centers of Roman civilization on the absolute frontier. The centuries of security that the army provided behind those walls allowed Greco-Roman culture to take root so deeply in the European soil that it became a permanent fixture of the landscape.
Weber points out that even centuries later, when the Roman Empire finally fell in the West and the barbarian invaders eventually broke through those defenses and took over, they weren't able to dispel the culture. The massive stone cities were there, the roads were there, the aqueducts were there. The physical infrastructure of civilization was set in stone.
And crucially, the language was there. Latin, because Latin was the official language of the army, the language of the law courts, and the language of the vast civil service bureaucracy. Education in Latin became the primary, indispensable vehicle for social mobility for anyone in the provinces.
It was a language of power.
If you were a Gaul or a Briton and you wanted a job in the government, if you wanted to improve your station, you learned Latin. It was a profound vehicle for socialization, actively teaching the conservative values, the laws, and the mindset of the Roman ruling class to people living thousands of miles from Rome itself.
It is incredible. The physical legacy of Rome wasn't just city placements on a map. They revolutionized the very way human beings experienced the built environment and organized their societies. Which leads us perfectly into the culmination of this dive, looking at the cultural blueprint, architecture, art, and the bureaucratization of faith.
When we talk about Roman cultural innovations, we almost inevitably compare them to the Greeks. The Romans themselves had been copying and importing Greek models, art, and philosophy for centuries, but the Romans added their own distinct transformative genius, which was heavily rooted in engineering, pragmatism, and intense, unvarnished realism.
Let's look at architecture as an example. The Greeks built undeniably beautiful things. Think of the Parthenon. But they were largely focused on the exterior aesthetic.
Yeah.
You stand outside and you look at a Greek temple. But the Romans, with their engineering advances, particularly the mastery of concrete, they figure out the arch. They figure out large-scale vaulting. They figure out the dome.
And that completely shifts the paradigm of what architecture can be. By mastering the dome and the vault, the Romans practically invented the concept of vast, impressive, unbroken interior space. You don't just look at a Roman building, you walk inside it, and you are physically dwarfed by the massive volume of space suspended above you.
Like the Pantheon.
Think of the Pantheon in Rome, with its massive concrete dome. It is a spectacular architectural advance that reflects their core desire not just for beauty, but for grandeur, structural permanence, and practical public use.
And that gritty practicality extended to their art, too. The Greeks loved idealism. They sculpted perfect, athletic, godlike bodies and perfectly symmetrical faces. The Romans, they wanted realism.
Absolutely. Roman sculpture, particularly their portraiture, reflects a highly practical, almost severe mindset known as verism, When you look at the portrait busts of the Roman emperors, generals, or leading citizens, which, by the way, were mass-produced and distributed to every corner of the empire as a highly effective form of political propaganda, they explicitly don't hide the flaws.
You see all the wrinkles.
You see receding hairlines, deep stress wrinkles, double chins, asymmetrical features. They wanted to capture the actual lived-in person. They wanted to project the stern gravitas, the authority, and the burden of the individual, not some flawless, idealized god.
Okay, so we have Roman cities, Roman roads, Roman architecture, Roman art and language spreading deep into Europe, across North Africa, and into the Middle East. But Professor Weber saves his absolute most profound, paradigm-shifting insight for the very end of his lecture. He reveals what he considers the ultimate lasting legacy of Augustus.
Yes. Augustus, by creating the Pax Romana, preserved the Greco-Roman tradition for posterity. If Augustus hadn't stabilized the system, if the Republic had just continued to blindly tear itself apart with rival warlords and endless civil wars, Rome would have lost its conquests one by one.
It would have just collapsed.
The empire would have inevitably relapsed into barbarism or fractured into a dozen petty warring tyrannies centuries before it actually did.
A parochial, fractured Rome would have been destroyed by its own internal violence. All the great institutions, the laws, the accumulated learning of the Greeks would have been choked and buried by the debris of constant grinding conflict.
Right.
But Augustus built a bureaucratic framework that was so incredibly strong, so deeply entrenched, that it outlasted him by centuries. And here's where it gets really, really interesting. Because that framework didn't just preserve the past, it shaped the future in a way literally nobody at the time could have predicted.
He is talking about the rise of Christianity. When the Christian faith emerged in the 1st century AD, it was growing completely within the borders of this massive, stable, highly organized Roman Empire.
It had a safe incubator.
And as it grew, as it expanded from a small sect into a global movement, it didn't just spread through the empire utilizing Roman roads and the Pax Romana, it actively absorbed the empire's organizational DNA.
This is the absolute mic drop moment of the lecture for me. The reforms of Augustus, the sprawling, centralized civil service, the strict hierarchical chain of command, the bureaucratic structure that he explicitly built to replace the chaotic republic, profoundly influenced the thinking and the organization of the early church.
It is a brilliant historical connection. The imperial tradition literally Romanized Christianity. As the church grew from a grassroots movement into a massive, multi-regional organization, it looked around for a functional model of how to govern a vast territory.
The only model was Rome.
And the most successful model available was the one Augustus had built. It helped make the church the great, organized, centralized, bureaucratized institution it eventually became. Quite literally, as Weber says, it became the Church of Rome.
We see it in the actual structure. The Pope essentially steps into the administrative and authoritative shoes of the emperor, even adopting the old Roman title Pontifex Maximus.
Yes, the chief priest.
The territorial dioceses of the church perfectly mirror the Roman provincial administration. The bishops act like provincial governors. It is a stunning, unbroken continuation of power and structural organization.
It really is. The Republic died a bloody death, the empire eventually fell centuries later, but the organizational architecture, the bureaucratic blueprint that Augustus built, survived the collapse of antiquity by being baptized.
Wow, what a journey. Let's recap this massive narrative for you listening. We started with the tragic, unavoidable irony of the Roman citizen farmer, conquering the world only to be bankrupted by an influx of cheap grain and replaced by brutal slave labor on massive, elite-owned estates.
The winner's curse.
We watched the political system absolutely fail to handle that resulting crisis, with a paralyzed, greedy Senate violently beating reformers like the Gracchi brothers to death with the very furniture of the Republic.
Which ultimately birthed the cynical, weaponized manipulation of the urban mob and set the stage for Marius to solve a military crisis by accidentally privatizing the legions.
The fatal pivot.
The loyalty of the soldier shifted fundamentally from the state to the warlord, giving us the grotesque arrogance of a Lucullus dining with himself, and the terrifying, extortionate reality of a Pompey or a Caesar using private armies to bleed the provinces dry and hold the Republic hostage.
Until finally the Republic collapses completely under the weight of its own success, and Augustus steps from the wreckage. He trades the illusion of Republican freedom for the harsh reality of autocratic security, builds an impenetrable meritocratic bureaucracy, and turns an army of conquest into a static army of defense.
And those border camps grew into the great cities of modern Europe.
Spreading a culture, a language, and a bureaucratic blueprint that eventually shaped the centralized hierarchical structure of global Christianity.
It is a master narrative of unintended consequences and structural inevitability, which leaves us with one final, deeply provocative thought to mull over as we close.
What's that?
We look back at Roman history, and we so often mourn the violent death of the Roman Republic. We view the assassination of Caesar and the rise of the emperors as a profound tragedy of lost liberty, the extinguishing of an ancient, noble, democratic ideal.
It is taught as the ultimate political cautionary tale.
But consider the actual historical evidence we have just walked through in detail. The Republic was an ancient municipal city council desperately trying to run a complex, globalized world. It was fundamentally, structurally incapable of managing its own massive success.
This is broken.
The greed, the corruption, the extortion of the provinces, the paralysis of the Senate, it was literally tearing the civilized world apart. So we must ask, is it possible that the Roman Republic had to die? Did that deeply flawed, chaotic, extortionate system have to be put out of its misery so that Roman civilization, and by extension, the architectural, cultural, and administrative foundations of the modern Western world, could actually survive?
That is a heavy, uncomfortable question to sit with. Sometimes the very thing that brings you your greatest success becomes the exact disease that kills you, and maybe in the end, winning doesn't solve your problems at all. It just forces you to evolve into something entirely different, something unrecognizable just in order to survive. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources. Keep digging, keep thinking, and keep questioning the world around you.